Hey guys, tonight we begin with firelight and sand. Picture yourself standing at the edge of an African desert, where the horizon is a trembling line between dusk and endless dunes. The heat of the day has only just loosened its grip, and the night presses in with a strange mix of relief and dread. The caravan around you stirs. Camels groan, leather packs creak, men tighten turbans and fuss with ropes. The firelight flickers against their faces, gold glancing off sweat, fear, and determination. You're about to step into a landscape where almost nothing wants you to live. And yes, I'll be blunt, you probably won't survive this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The caravan forms up. Torches sputter in the wind, throwing wild shadows that lick across dunes like restless spirits. You trudge forward with the others, sand crunching under leather soles. The fire behind fades into a pinprick, and suddenly the world is nothing but shifting sand and the rhythmic sway of camels humps ahead. You've joined a tradition that stretches back thousands of years. Merchants, pilgrims, slaves, and wanderers crossing deserts not for glory, but because life demanded it. Gold, salt, and survival moved through these dunes. And all of it hinged on one problem. How do you find your way when the desert itself is constantly trying to erase the path? Here, in the hush of night, you feel both awe and terror. Firelight is fragile. Sand infinite. If the stars above offered a stable guide, you'd relax, but already a thin haze is crawling across the sky. Soon, the heavens will vanish, as they so often do here, swallowed by desert storms, dust, or sheer bad luck. Navigation becomes a gamble, unless you know the secret tricks. The men at the front aren't ordinary wanderers. They're guides, men whose eyes scan every dune as if the sand itself whispers to them. And here's your first historical fact of the night. Trans-Saharan caravans often relied on specialized guides called azagar in some Berber tongues. Literally, those who show the way. Without them, entire groups vanished. They were worth more than the gold they carried, because gold is useless if you never make it to market. Your feet sink into cool sand, and you notice how the torchlight bends oddly. Shadows don't behave normally here. They stretch, snap, and vanish as if the desert mocks human rules. But that bending light is not just eerie. It's useful. You learn, stumbling along, that even firelight can be a compass of sorts. Watch how flames flicker. Wind always finds its way across the dunes. The guides know which direction the gusts normally lean in this season. You don't, of course. To you, it's just smoke choking your nose and ash blowing into your eyes. Here's a quirky tidbit to keep in mind. Some guides swore that the crackle of fire itself could warn them of a coming sandstorm. Dry desert air carries sound differently, and a sudden muffling or odd hiss in the flames was said to signal a shift in weather. Historians still argue whether this was practical science, air density changes, or desert superstition. But as your torch dims and your throat dries, you're too tired to question it. Hours pass. Your calves ache. You find yourself falling into the rhythm of the caravan. One step, then another. The firelit circle grows smaller, until only faint embers glow at the rear. Then it's gone, leaving only the soft light of the moon struggling through the haze. You're swallowed in silence, broken only by the squelch of camel feet and the occasional jingle of a harness. It feels like you're walking inside the world's largest whisper. The guide pauses, raising his hand. Everyone halts. Your heart thumps. Are you lost already? He kneels, plunges his hand into the sand, lifts a fistful, and lets the grains slip through his fingers. To you, it looks like nothing. To him, it's a book. The grid is course tonight, blowing from the north. He knows, somehow, that the nearest well lies 2 days east, and he adjusts the line of the caravan accordingly. You're reminded of how a sailor at sea reads waves. Only here, the ocean is solid, and the waves are frozen into dunes. The desert smells of nothing, dryness so pure it burns your nose. Then suddenly, faintly, there's smoke again. Not from your own torches this time, but from a cooking fire many dunes away. You can't see it, but the guide's nose twitches like a hound's. He mutters something and shifts the caravan slightly. These men claim they can smell life at impossible distances. Water, firewood, the sweat of another camp. You might roll your eyes, but in this moment, you hope it's true. Camels grunt. Their shadows loom like swaying ships. You're no sailor, but the analogy is apartment. That's exactly how Arab chroniclers once described desert travel, as an ocean without water. And like an ocean, the desert offers no landmarks at night, unless you count the moon, which keeps ducking behind sheets of airborne dust. You wonder if maybe you should have stayed back at the fire. At least death would have been warmer. A man ahead chuckles quietly, snapping you from your thoughts. He's singing a low, throaty chant. Others join, a hum that threads through the dark. It's not for entertainment, though it keeps spirits alive. The chant marks time. Each verse corresponds to a distance, a pace, a memory of where the caravan should be by dawn. These songs are as much a navigation tool as a map, though you don't yet realize it. Later, you'll notice how the guide nods subtly with each verse, keeping the group in rhythm with a journey mapped only in his head. The sand shifts beneath you, tricking your ankles. One wrong step and you sink scrambling, until a hand hauls you back upright. You mutter thanks. The man only shrugs. Falling behind here is not an option. The desert swallows stragglers without ceremony. And yes, that's a historical fact too. Chronicles record whole groups who stop to rest, only to vanish, never seen again. The desert doesn't forgive hesitation. But there's humor too, in strange places. Someone mutters that your clumsy fall is a sign the gods don't want you here. Another jokes you'll serve as camel fodder by sunrise. The group laughs softly. It's morbid, but the desert breeds dark humor. Laughter is lighter than fear. And maybe you laugh too, because what else can you do? Hours blur. The night grows colder than you thought possible. The desert burns by day but freezes by night, a cruel joke of physics. Your teeth chatter, your toes sting. A guide notices and tosses you a scrap of wool to wrap around yourself. You nod gratefully. Ahead, the lead camel snorts and halts again. The guide climbs a dune, scans the darkness, then raises his hand. In the far distance, you glimpse a faint shimmer, barely visible in the moonlight. A well, an oasis, salvation. You can't tell. It might be nothing more than a mirage, a cruel trick. Historians still argue whether mirages fooled caravans into ruin more often than saved them with hope. Tonight, you cling to the possibility it's real. The caravan shifts again, adjusting course. You follow, stumbling but alive, carried along by the rhythm of firelight fading, sand whispering, and the fragile thread of human persistence weaving through endless night. And so your journey begins. The stars should be your anchor. That's what you've always been told. Travelers follow the constellations, sailors cling to Polaris, and every romantic notion of journeying at night comes back to the sky. But here, in the vast African desert, the stars are unreliable companions. Tonight, a wall of fine dust rides on the wind, blotting out the heavens. You glance upward, searching for some twinkling reassurance, but it's gone. Just a dim orange haze, moon-smothered, sky-smudged, and a creeping sense that the universe has been erased. The men around you don't panic. This is normal. They adjust turbans tighter over their mouths, let their camels lower their heads against the sting, and press on. The guides know something you don't. When the stars betray you, the earth itself offers clues, though they're subtler, harsher, and demand years of training to read. Historians still argue whether most caravans were truly helpless without stars. Some records suggest guides simply sat and waited for the skies to clear, while others insist they had entire toolkits of starless navigation. Either way, you're experiencing firsthand what it feels like when the cosmic map vanishes. And believe me, you're already wishing for a better travel insurance plan. You stumble in the darkness, coughing on dust. The torchlight ahead dims, smothered by the storm's breath. The group huddles tighter, each camel pressing flank to flank. The caravan feels less like a proud march now, and more like a desperate clump of shadows. You squint and realize how terrifying this is. The desert isn't just a place where you can get lost. It's a place where the sky itself disappears. One of the guides, his eyes squinting against grit, gestures upward with a short stick. He mutters something about the stars being liars tonight, hidden by jealous winds. It's half a joke, half a warning. Then he points to the ground instead. The lesson is clear. Forget the heavens, trust the earth. A historical fact to ground you. Islamic scholars in cities like Cairo and Timbuktu were masters of astronomy, but caravan guides often had little formal training. Their expertise wasn't charts or sextants. It was experience, watching patterns of dunes, winds, and even the way animals behaved. In other words, while sailors stared upward, desert travelers stared outward. Here's a quirky tidbit for your sleepless brain. Some desert peoples believed stars could be stolen by spirits during sandstorms, hidden away until appeased with prayer or song. Imagine blaming the weather on cosmic theft. It makes your own frustration at cloudy skies feel a little silly, doesn't it? The wind whistles against your ears. Sand clings to your lashes, forming little prickling weights that make your eyes water. Every blink feels like dragging glass across your corneas. You try to rub them, but your fingers are gritty too. Welcome to the desert spa. Exfoliation guaranteed, no refunds. Despite the misery, the caravan trudges forward, because stopping is worse. Sand berries. Camels panic if tethered too long in the wind. And so you keep walking. The rhythm of hooves continues, muffled by sand's cushion, a dull thud-thud-thud that becomes hypnotic. The absence of stars above is almost matched by the silence below, broken only by the scrape of sandals and the occasional muttered curse. The guide at the front stops suddenly, crouches low, and presses his ear against the ground. You frown. What on earth is he doing? After a long pause, he rises, nods, and continues. Later, someone explains. In the stillness of a storm, you can sometimes hear distant movement through the ground. Another caravan, perhaps, or the echo of camels padding along a buried trail. Whether this is reliable science or romantic desert myth, historians still debate. But you know what? In that moment, you're impressed enough not to question it. The storm thickens, and the firelight dwindles. You try to picture the constellations above, Orion's belt, the North Star, but it's like trying to paint over darkness with your mind. It doesn't help. You feel adrift. And then you realize, that's the trick. That's the point. In the desert, you can't rely on what you think you know. Forgetting the stars is part of learning. A man beside you chuckles through his scarf. First time, he asks, his words muffled. You nod, eyes squinted shut against the grit. He laughs again, deeper this time. You'll learn. Or you won't. Either way, the desert decides. Comforting, right? The group pauses again as the guide raises a hand. You all crouch, huddling to shield the torches from the gusts. A single ember sparks upward, instantly swallowed by the storm. You feel tiny, an insect in an ocean of grit. And yet, there's resilience here. No stars, no problem. These people have done this before, countless times, and they trust that dawn will eventually break. That's the unspoken promise of every caravan night. Keep walking, keep trusting, and eventually the sun will rescue you. You cling to that thought, even as your teeth crunch with sand and your tongue sticks to the roof of your mouth. And in that gritty darkness, the lesson lands. The stars may guide sailors, poets, and dreamers, but out here in the endless dunes, stars are optional. Survival is not. The storm eventually thins, leaving behind a hushed desert that feels freshly swept, as though some invisible hand erased every trace of the world. The stars are still shy, hidden behind a film of dust, but the moon fights through, casting pale silver streaks across the dunes. You squint, exhausted, and realize that the guides are already busy with their next trick, reading the shadows. You probably think of shadows as just annoying stretches of dark under your feet, but here they are a compass. As the moon arcs across the sky, the length and tilt of each shadow tells a story. By day, the sun sharpens them. By night, the moon softens them. Either way, Experienced eyes know how to translate those silent lines into direction. You watch as one of the guides holds a stick upright, plants it firmly in the sand, and waits. Slowly, the shadow creeps to one side. He grunts, nods, and gestures the caravan forward at a precise angle. That's your first mainstream fact tonight. Long before compasses were common in Africa's interior, guides used the sun's arc and the shadows of objects as makeshift sundials. They didn't just glance, they measured movement over time, memorized the seasonal tilt of light, and aligned it with their routes. A stick, a shadow, and patience, that was their compass. The desert, though, adds mischief. Dunes rise and fall, bending shadows into curves. Your tired eyes can't tell the difference between a natural slope and an intentional direction. But the guides, they can. It's like watching a chess master glance at a board and predict 20 moves ahead. You marvel, though mostly you just want a nap. And here's your quirky tidbit. Some guides swore they could use their own bodies as shadow compasses, spitting in the sand to make a dark spot, then using their nose, chest, or elbow to judge where the shadow would creep. Sounds silly, but hey, if you're stuck in the Sahara with no tools, you might as well try elbow navigation. Historians still argue whether this was a legitimate technique, or more like desert bravado, the equivalent of saying, "I can open a beer bottle with my teeth." The moonlight stretches the caravan's shadows across the dunes. They look like a procession of giants, tall and solemn, trudging beside you. It's eerie, like you're walking in two caravans, the flesh and blood one, and its ghostly twin. You try to focus on your steps, but your eyes keep drifting to the wavering silhouettes, until you feel half certain one shadow moved the wrong way. Maybe you're just sleep-deprived. Maybe the desert is laughing again. Your throat burns. Every breath rasps, pulling grit deep into your lungs. You dream of water. The guides don't even mention thirst. To them, it's as natural as sand in your shoes. They read the shadows, point forward, and expect you to keep walking. You admire their composure, though secretly, you think they're all part camel themselves. By day, shadows become brutal truth-tellers. The sun rises like a white-hot coin, and suddenly every dune casts a jagged, knife-edged silhouette. The caravan halts briefly as the guides check the angle again. One kneels, squints at a stick's shadow, and mutters something about half the length by midday. You realize this is more than guesswork. It's arithmetic carved into memory. They know how long a shadow should be at certain times of day, and if it's shorter or longer, they adjust course. Historians still argue whether this knowledge came originally from ancient Egyptian shadow clocks or developed independently among desert tribes. Either way, you're impressed. You can barely calculate your phone's battery life without anxiety, and these men are doing geometry with nothing but the sun and sand. A joke circles the caravan. Someone says the guide is just pretending, staring at shadows to look wise, when really he's just following the camels, who always know the way. Everyone laughs, even the guide. The desert may be deadly, but humor remains the best survival tool. You keep trudging. The shadows stretch, shorten, then vanish under the overhead sun. For a terrifying hour, there are no shadows at all, only blinding white heat pressing down. You panic. How do they navigate now? But the guide simply waits, squatting calmly until the sun tilts again. Shadows return, faint but enough. Direction is restored. You feel foolish for doubting, but also relieved. That's the strange thing about this journey. What seems fragile, a line of darkness, a flicker of flame, a sniff of wind, turns out to be the most reliable compass of all. You realize how little you've ever truly noticed your own shadow back home. Here, though, it might just save your life. And so, under the watchful dance of shadows, the caravan presses forward, footsteps measured not by roads, not by stars, but by the tilt of light itself. Your legs already ache, and you've only been walking a handful of days. Each step sinks into soft sand or crunches against crusted earth. But the guides remind you, gently and sometimes mockingly, that the desert doesn't care about your soreness. What it does care about, strangely enough, is rhythm. And tonight, you learn the next secret of navigation, counting camel steps. It sounds ridiculous, doesn't it? Counting while trudging through a wasteland? But out here, camels are clocks on four legs. Their hooves strike the ground in a steady beat, and each stride is nearly uniform. A trained guide can count those steps and convert them into distance. 1,000 paces, 2,000, 10,000. Numbers stack in the guide's head like invisible milestones. That's the mainstream historical fact of the night. Desert travelers often measured journeys by camel strides and breaths rather than by maps. An average camel step is about a meter long, and the beasts maintain an unhurried but steady pace that makes them perfect living odometers. A guide could tell you with shocking accuracy how far you'd marched since sunrise, even if the world looked exactly the same in every direction. The desert, though, adds its mischief again. Sand shifts. Dunes rise, slow camels force detours. So the rhythm is never quite perfect. That's why the counting wasn't done blindly. It was paired with memory, with landmarks, with chants that locked numbers into song. Tonight you hear it. A soft, steady murmur runs through the caravan. One line repeated after another, a chant that feels like a lullaby. It's not only to keep the camels calm, it's to keep the guide's count straight. You find yourself falling into the beat. Step, sway, grunt chant. It becomes hypnotic, like you're trapped inside a giant metronome. For a moment, you forget your thirst. Forget the endless sand. You're just a cog in this walking clock. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some accounts claim guides could even calculate distance by a camel's chewing. Yes, chewing. Supposedly, a camel needed a certain number of mouthfuls before slowing to rest, and experienced herders could use that to guess how far they'd traveled since the last grazing. Historians still argue whether this was practical wisdom or a traveler's tall tale. But hey, if you ever need a desert Fitbit, maybe consider a camel's jaw. The desert around you looks the same, rolling dunes, broken only by the occasional scrub bush or jagged rock. But the guide's inner abacus keeps moving forward. You wonder if he ever loses count. He doesn't. Or if he does, he hides it perfectly, masking mistakes under confidence. Out here, you realize confidence itself is part of navigation. If the caravan believed their leader was lost, panic would spread like fire. The camels grunt, tails swishing lazily against flies. Their eyelids droop, half asleep, even as their feet keep moving. You envy them. They look utterly indifferent to survival, as if they were built from sand itself. You're the weak one here, sweating, stumbling, constantly glancing back to see how far you've come. The answer is always the same: not far enough. At midday, the guide calls for rest. You collapse gratefully under a tattered cloth stretched between two saddles, a patch of shade that feels like heaven. You gulp at a leather flask, water warm as blood, but precious. The guide, meanwhile, squats and scratches numbers in the sand with a stick. He's recording his mental count, not on parchment, but on the desert itself. He smooths the marks away as soon as he finishes, like a magician erasing clues. It's for him, not for you. One of the caravan men leans close and jokes that guides could count to 1,000,000 without ever losing track, but only if you promise them payment in salt instead of coin. Everyone chuckles. Salt is, after all, the gold of this land. The joke lightens the mood, though your legs still throb. When the march resumes, you notice how the guide keeps humming under his breath, barely audible. You realize it's not a tune for pleasure. It's a mnemonic device, a way to lock numbers into melody so they won't drift away in fatigue. It's like a desert version of singing the alphabet song to remember your ABCs. And yes, you think bitterly, maybe you need your own song just to remember how to keep walking. Historians still argue whether caravans carried formal tally sticks or knots in ropes as backup counters. Some swear they did. Others believe oral and mental counting was sacred tradition, too important to trust to objects that could be lost. Either way, you sense that the real answer is probably both, depending on the guide, the tribe, and the route. By evening, the count reaches another invisible milestone. The guide announces they're approaching an old landmark, though your eyes see nothing but sand. Sure enough, as twilight deepens, a circle of stones emerges, half buried, forgotten by most, but remembered in the guide's count. You marvel. Without stars, without maps, without even visible markers, this man has steered dozens of lives to this exact point. And you just followed, trusting in numbers carried on camel feet. By now, you've learned that the desert offers guides in strange forms: shadows, steps, winds. But tonight, as the air cools and the moon rises, you discover one of the strangest claims of all: that skilled desert travelers could smell their way toward water. You scoff at first. After all, water has no smell, right? But out here, where the air is bone dry, even the faintest trace of moisture carries. Some guides insist they can detect the sweet, damp scent of an oasis long before it comes into view. As you shuffle forward, sweat crusting on your skin, you hope desperately that this isn't one of those tall tales invented to torture newcomers. Here's your historical fact. Multiple accounts from Saharan and Sahelian traders mention guides who could locate hidden wells or underground rivers by smell. In a land where survival often depended on the next sip, such skill wasn't just legend, it was life or death. Even Islamic geographers writing in far-off courts recorded stories of men who seemed to sniff the desert like hounds. You're not convinced. You inhale deeply, filling your lungs with what feels like powdered glass. All you get is dust. Dust, camel dung, and maybe the faint whiff of leather. You're about to laugh it off when one of the guides halts, tilts his head, and draws a slow breath through his nose. He nods. He swears there's water. Quirky tidbit time. Some Berber tribes believe that certain men and women were born with a special gift, an inherited sensitivity in the nose that allowed them to hear the desert's breath. They called them by nicknames that translate loosely to nose walkers. It sounds funny now, but when you're half dead from thirst, you start hoping you're walking with at least one nose walker in the group. The caravan shifts slightly east. You doubt. The dunes look identical. The air feels unchanged. But hours later, just as your tongue feels like cracked clay, the faint shimmer of palm tops appears on the horizon. An oasis. Real. You blink in disbelief. The guide wasn't bluffing. Historians still argue whether this was truly smell or a mix of subtle clues. Dampness in the breeze, cooler sand, even insect patterns. Perhaps the smell of water was shorthand for a dozen observations, collapsed into one poetic claim. But in the moment, none of that matters. You want to throw yourself into the pool the second it appears. Of course, desert oases aren't tropical resorts. The water is brackish, the palms sparse, the shade meager. But to you, it feels like paradise. Camels groan with relief, kneeling as if in prayer. Men laugh, splash, gulp greedily. You press your face to the water's surface, drinking until your belly aches. Never mind the grit that sticks to your lips. You've never tasted anything so good. A joke ripples through the group. One man says you smell like a drowned goat after dunking your head. Another claims the guide only smelled the water because your sweaty foreign skin gave off desperation. You laugh weakly. Out here, mockery is just another form of affection. As the night deepens, you lie awake on the sand, staring at the stars that finally peek through the haze. You think about how fragile this chain of survival is. One man's nose, one guess, one hidden well. A mistake would mean death. Yet somehow it works. Year after year, caravans survive, guided by senses you barely believe possible. You close your eyes, still thirsty despite your fill, and wonder whether, with enough time, you too could learn to smell the desert's secrets. Or maybe you'd always just smell like the unlucky traveler who needed rescuing. Either way, you're alive tonight, and that's enough. You wake before dawn, still sore from yesterday's march, and notice how the sand feels different beneath your fingers. Not just soft dunes or gritty dust, something more subtle, like the grains have their own personalities. The guides rise too, stretching, wrapping their turbans tight again, and you watch one of them scoop a handful of sand, roll it between his palms, and let it trickle away. He nods, as though it just spoke to him. That's when you learn another desert secret. The sand itself can be read like a book. To your untrained eyes, it's just sand, beige, endless, and slightly cruel. But to a skilled guide, the tilt of a dune, the coarseness of its grains, and even the way it reflects light can point the way. Some dunes lean toward the prevailing winds, others reveal where storms passed last season, and certain types of grit only form near dry riverbeds. It's as if every handful of sand carries a memory. Here's your historical fact. Saharan guides really did rely on dune formation. The long ridges, called seefs, usually run parallel to dominant winds, so reading their alignment helps fix direction. The Tuareg especially became famous for this skill, navigating thousands of kilometers by noting which way the dunes slept. You walk with them, squinting at slopes. One guide gestures with his staff at a dune's ridge, explaining that it tilts east because of the way seasonal winds bite into it. You nod politely, but honestly it looks like, well, just another sand pile. He grins at your blank face, amused by your ignorance. It's the grin of someone who knows the desert will train you in its own time, if it lets you live that long. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some travelers swore that certain sands sang. When wind blew across the dunes just right, the grains rubbed together and made a low humming sound, like a drum. Guides said this music wasn't just eerie but useful. The pitch told them the size of the grains, which in turn hinted at nearby geography. Historians still argue whether this was genuine navigation or just a spooky desert sideshow, but the phenomenon of singing dunes is real. You imagine walking through a landscape that hums like a giant organ, and suddenly you're not sure if that's comforting or nightmare fuel. The sun rises higher, and the world turns into a blinding mirror. Every dune looks the same, shimmering under the heat. You feel dizzy, tricked by the sameness. Yet the guides never waver. They pause now and then, crouching to pinch sand between their fingers, letting it fall, watching which way it drifts. It's like they're holding whispered conversations with the earth while you lumber behind, clueless. At midday, while the caravan rests, you try the trick yourself. You scoop sand, squeeze it, and let it go. It spills, of course, sand always spills. You announce your grand conclusion. It's sandy. The men laugh until one nearly chokes on his dried dates. The guide claps your shoulder, shaking his head, but not unkindly. Everyone was clueless once, he reminds you. You smile, embarrassed but oddly proud to be included in the humor. Historians still argue whether caravans taught newcomers these skills slowly or kept them secret to ensure their monopoly as indispensable guides. Some records suggest deliberate secrecy, others suggest patient apprenticeship. Judging by your experience, you'd bet on both. They'll laugh at you now, but maybe if you survive, they'll let you in on a few real lessons. As the march continues, you start noticing tiny differences too. The sand under one dune feels finer, almost silky, while another patch crunches sharply, mixed with salt. One guide explains that the salt-crusted grains mark an old dry lake bed, a reminder that water once lived here. He says it casually, but to you it feels profound, like holding proof that the desert was not always desert. By nightfall, the dunes are tall silhouettes against a fading sky. You lie down, sore and weary, and sift a handful of sand through your fingers. For the first time, it doesn't feel meaningless. The desert has fingerprints, and you're just starting to learn how to read them. The night is quiet, but not silent. There's always some sound in the desert if you listen long enough. The shuffle of hooves, the sigh of sand, the faint creak of leather straps. Tonight, though, the most important sound comes from the air itself. The wind rises, not in a violent storm this time, but in a steady, whispering stream. Scarves flap, tent cloth ripples, and every dune seems to lean in the same direction. This is when you learn the next trick, following the wind. To you, wind is just a nuisance. It dries your lips, blinds your eyes with grit, and makes your skin sting. But to the guides, it's as much a compass as the stars ever were. The Sahara, after all, has prevailing winds, trade winds that blow from east to west, harmattan gusts that pour down from the north. By feeling their constancy, a skilled traveler can orient the caravan even on the darkest, most starless nights. Here's your historical fact. The harmattan wind, a dry northeasterly that sweeps across West Africa, was was both feared and welcomed. It could suffocate caravans with dust, but also acted like a guiding hand, reminding them which way the desert itself leaned. Some routes were plotted around the predictable rhythm of these winds, turning atmospheric chaos into reliable signposts. You're skeptical. You lick your lips, sand. You turn your head, more sand. It all feels equally unpleasant. But the guides seem to listen with their whole bodies. One stands still, letting his robes billow. Another licks a finger and holds it to the air. The youngest even tosses a scrap of cloth into the breeze, watching it dance before pointing east. You try the same with your own rag. It blows into your face. So much for desert wisdom. Quirky tidbit. Some desert herders claimed camels' ears made the best wind gauges. Supposedly, the animals twitch them more in certain gusts, and their fur ripples like living weather veins. You chuckle at the thought. Imagine needing a 1,000-pound mammal just to tell north from south. Yet the guide pats his camel affectionately, murmuring that she's smarter than the stars. Maybe it's not entirely a joke. The caravan shifts its line according to the breeze. You fall in step, though you can't quite grasp how a moving, invisible force can be trusted. Isn't wind fickle? Doesn't it change every hour? Historians still argue whether caravans relied too heavily on winds, or whether winds were simply a last resort when other cues failed. But tonight, you see it working, because after hours of trudging, the hazy outline of a familiar ridge rises where the guide said it would. The desert humbles you again. What seemed random turns out to be reliable, if you know how to read it. The wind grows stronger as the sun rises. Sand grains sting your cheeks, tiny needles flung by invisible hands. You squint and wrap your scarf tighter, cursing under your breath. Meanwhile, the guides lean into it calmly, as though the wind is an old companion. You hear one of them laugh, saying the harmattan is like a nagging mother-in-law. You hate it, but you'd be lost without it. The group chuckles. You add in-law humor to the long list of things that keep caravans sane. At midday, you rest again. The guides anchor cloths against the wind, creating blessed patches of shade. You notice how they always set up camp with their backs to the gusts, arranging camels so their bulky bodies block the worst of it. It's choreography, perfected over centuries. You're grateful to be included in the dance. That evening, as the caravan pushes on, the breeze softens. The dunes no longer sing with rushing air. You feel suddenly vulnerable, as if someone just turned off the desert's GPS. But the guide shrugs, points at the faint slope of a dune, and says he doesn't need the wind anymore. Its whisper has already carried them far enough. You fall asleep thinking about how bizarre this world is, where even air itself can become a compass. Back home, you'd curse a windy day. Here, it might just save your life. You wake to the slow sway of the camel beneath you. The morning air is crisp for once, though you know the sun will soon turn this chill into something unbearable. As the caravan moves forward, the dunes thin out, giving way to stretches of flatter sand, dotted with sparse, stubborn plants. It feels almost alien, like you've stepped into a minimalist painting where every brushstroke counts. Then you notice them, trees. Not many, and not tall. Scattered across the emptiness, each one stands like a sentinel, warped and bent by the desert's moods. The guide's eyes flick to them immediately, as if they've been waiting for this sign. One nods, adjusts his course slightly, and the entire caravan follows suit. Here's your next lesson. In the desert, even a tree is a compass. The acacia is the most common. Spindly, thorny, and stubborn, it leans in the direction of prevailing winds. You wouldn't notice it if you weren't looking, but to the trained eye, its shape screams orientation. Centuries of gusts sculpt its branches until they grow away from the onslaught. In a world where your smartphone would die within hours, these trees are like living north arrows. Mainstream historical fact: acacias, dum palms, and tamarisks were often cataloged by caravan guides, not as resources to harvest, but as waypoints to memorize. Some guides could list dozens in a row across hundreds of miles, each tree as familiar to them as the corner store on your block. For traders crossing the Sahara, a bent acacia might mean they were still on the path to Tagaza's salt mines, or nearing the edge of a wadi with a hidden spring. You squint at one such acacia. To you, it looks like a bad houseplant someone forgot to water. But the guide taps his stick against its trunk, then gestures east. He doesn't even speak, just trusts that you'll understand. You nod sagely, pretending you do. Inside, though, you're thinking, how can a half-dead tree know more than me with my entire brain? Quirky tidbit. Some oral traditions claim certain trees were planted intentionally by early travelers to serve as long-term markers. Imagine that a family passing through 300 years ago might have dropped a seed, and now that spindly survivor tells you which way to go. Historians aren't sure whether that's true or just a bit of desert romance, but you have to admit it's a lovely thought. Navigation as an inheritance that literally grows from the ground. The caravan continues, weaving from tree to tree. They're not frequent enough to make a straight line. You might see one on the horizon every few miles if you're lucky, but when you connect them in your mind, the route starts to make sense. It's like a constellation, except rooted in sand instead of sky. And sometimes, they offer more than direction. You stop beside one dum palm that clings desperately to life. Its fruit, brown and hard, dangles from the fronds. The guides share a few pieces, cracking them open for the faintly sweet pulp. You chew cautiously. It tastes like a mix of gingerbread and sawdust, but you're grateful all the same. These moments remind you that survival out here isn't just about finding your way. It's about eking out whatever comfort the desert grudgingly offers. Historians still argue whether the reliance on trees was universal or more localized. After all, not every desert zone boasts vegetation. In the most barren stretches, guides leaned on other tricks. But in transition zones, where vegetation clings to life, the trees become vital, like punctuation marks in an otherwise endless sentence of sand. As the day drags on, you feel almost reassured each time another tree appears. It breaks the monotony, gives you something to focus on, and it makes you marvel. The desert may seem dead, but every scrap of life here doubles as a survival tool. Even a single crooked branch can carry the memory of centuries of travelers. That night, you lie back in your saddle blanket, staring at the silhouette of an acacia etched against the starlit horizon. It's nothing special, small, scraggly, unimpressive. But in this emptiness, it's as powerful as a lighthouse. You drift into sleep wondering how many lost souls found their way home because one stubborn little tree refused to die. Morning breaks with a hazy glow, and the caravan stirs like some great, slow beast waking up. The camels grunt, the guides mutter, and you rub the sleep from your eyes as another day in the desert yawns open before you. The air already tastes of dryness. You feel like even your tongue is turning into sandpaper. The guides don't seem fazed. One of them points at the ground, where the sand is dusted with a pale crust that crunches faintly under the camel's broad feet. At first you think it's just dried mud, but then you notice the whiteness glittering under the rising sun. Salt. This is your next lesson. The desert keeps maps written in salt. Caravans once carried enormous slabs of this stuff. Whole camel trains devoted just to salt, as precious as gold, sometimes even more so. And the routes they took became scarred into the earth itself. When a caravan walked the same path for generations, the land held the memory. Beaten ground, churned to powder, salted by the loads that leaked or shattered. Even now, centuries later, the scars linger like faint chalk lines. Mainstream historical fact. The salt mines of Tagaza, deep in the Sahara, supplied much of West Africa for centuries. Caravans transported great slabs hundreds of miles across brutal terrain. Some slabs measured nearly a man's height, and each was so heavy it took a camel or two just to drag it. Traders followed established salt roads religiously, because wandering even a little off-track meant death. Over time, these roads weren't just remembered by people. They were carved into the desert itself. You glance at the crust beneath your camel's feet. It crunches louder than the soft sand around it. The guide dips a finger, touches it to his tongue, and nods. You try it too, instantly regretting the decision. It's like licking the rim of an old sweat-soaked frying pan. Still, the taste is proof. You're on a road older than most countries. Quirky tidbit. Travelers used to joke that the desert itself sweated salt after too many caravans trudged across it. Others whispered that the white crust was the ghost of ancient seas, a reminder that this whole Sahara was once lush grassland and lakes. Technically, they weren't wrong. The Sahara has shifted climates many times, leaving behind fossil riverbeds and dried salt flats. Which means in some twisted way, your mouthful of sweat-flavored grit might actually be the echo of a long-vanished ocean. Bon appetit. The caravan follows the salty scars with quiet confidence. You start to notice how the trail doesn't just stretch endlessly straight. It bends, curves, and dodges obstacles that only make sense once you're on it. The guides don't just follow the salt. They also read where it thickens, where it fades, where it leads towards safer dunes or the promise of an old well. To your untrained eye, it looks random. To them, it's as clear as a highway exit sign. Historians still argue whether all salt routes were permanent or whether caravans often shifted slightly with each season. Some say the mines, wells, and markets anchored routes so tightly they became almost unchangeable. Others suggest the desert itself constantly pushed caravans to adapt, sand burying one road, opening another. You look around at the shifting dunes, and honestly, you'd put your money on the desert winning every argument. Midday comes, and the crust brightens under the punishing sun until it almost blinds you. Your eyelids feel gritty, your lips cracked. The camels seem unfazed, though a few pause to paw at the ground where the salt lies thicker. They aren't after the taste. You remember from some guides' mutterings that camels crave minerals, licking or nibbling at salty crusts for strength. Even the beasts treat the desert's map as both a guide and a snack. The silence grows heavy in the afternoon heat. Without trees or rocks, the salt path is the only constant marker. You start imagining it as a kind of ghostly rope stretched across the desert. One you cling to even though it's fragile, faint, and easy to lose in a storm. You remember the warnings from earlier nights. A caravan that strays off this line is a caravan swallowed whole. By dusk, the salt trail leads you to what looks like nothing more than a shallow pit. But the guides celebrate softly. It's a long-abandoned salt station, just enough shelter to pause for the night. You sit on the brittle crust, staring at the glittering whiteness glowing under the stars, and realize the desert keeps its own memory. Not in books, not in maps, but in the flavor of its ground. You roll onto your blanket, chuckling at the thought. Entire empires built fortunes because some traders decided to follow a taste. Sweet dreams, you tell yourself, though your tongue still feels like you've licked a rusted battery. You wake with the faint sound of tapping, almost like a drummer rehearsing on a hollow skin. At first you think you're dreaming, but when you sit up, you see one of the guides crouched by a patch of bare earth, rhythmically knocking a stick against the ground. Tap, pause, tap, tap. It's like Morse code, but older, slower, rooted in the soil. Welcome to another trick of the desert, listening to the ground itself. By day, you follow salt scars. But by night, or when storms wipe tracks away, caravans sometimes rely on a subtler guide, the vibration of the earth. Imagine trudging hundreds of miles, blind in a sandstorm, and still being able to sense the direction of life-saving wells just from how sound travels beneath your feet. It sounds like sorcery, but the desert is full of sorcery that turns out to be survival science in disguise. Mainstream historical fact. Caravan guides were known for their uncanny ability to locate wells hidden beneath dunes. Some could walk for hours, strike the ground with a stick, and judge from the sound whether water lay below, or whether a buried stone-lined cistern, built centuries earlier, still existed under layers of sand. These cisterns, dug by Berber and Tuareg ancestors, kept water cool and hidden from both evaporation and raiders. Without them, long-distance travel across the Sahara would have been impossible. The guide taps again. This time, you crouch beside him and put your ear to the earth. The sound is faint, but you swear the echo feels different from the dry patches you passed earlier. Almost hollow. He nods, grins a toothy grin, and points at the ground. Water is close. Not a lake, not even a puddle, just enough to keep the caravan alive. You realize you're listening to the Earth's private drumbeat, a rhythm only the trained can follow. Quirky tidbit. Some travelers swore that desert foxes and jerboas also danced on certain patches of Earth because they sensed underground water. Legends grew that if you followed the nocturnal hopping of tiny rodents, you'd find a hidden well. Of course, that assumes the rodents weren't just partying. Still, guides sometimes used animal patterns as extra confirmation. The desert, after all, doesn't waste coincidences. By midday, the caravan halts at what looks like a random depression between dunes. The camels kneel, their masters start digging with bowls and hands. At first, nothing but dust. Then wet sand. Then, at last, a slow ooze of cool water fills the shallow pit. It's not a spring worthy of poetry. It smells faintly metallic, tinged with the taste of stone. But to you, it might as well be nectar. You drink greedily, letting it spill down your chin, while the camels gulp gallons, as if they've been holding their thirst in a locked vault. Historians still argue whether these wells were mostly natural, or whether entire networks of them were dug intentionally, maintained across generations. Some accounts insist they were carefully engineered, spaced like stepping stones across trade corridors. Others claim most wells were accidents of geology, ancient aquifers breaking the surface here and there, and guides simply knew where to look. The truth, like the water, probably lies somewhere hidden beneath layers of shifting sand. As the day stretches on, you start paying closer attention to the ground under your own feet. Each crunch, each thud, each muffled echo feels like part of a giant instrument. You imagine the desert as one enormous drum stretched tight, and you're a flea hopping across its skin. The idea makes you laugh under your breath, though your lips are so dry it comes out more like a wheeze. By evening, you understand why this method of finding direction matters just as much as the salt scars. Sandstorms can erase trails in minutes. Dunes walk across the land like migrating beasts, hiding wells beneath 50 feet of grit. But the sound, the resonance of life underground, can't be erased so easily. As long as you're patient enough to listen, the desert still hums its secrets. That night, you lie awake with your ear pressed to the sand, as if trying to catch the whisper of buried rivers. Maybe it's just your imagination, or maybe the earth really does sigh under you like some ancient sleeper dreaming. Either way, it rocks you gently towards sleep, like the desert itself is humming you a lullaby. The next morning, you stumble upon a sight both eerie and oddly comforting. A line of bones half buried in the sand. Camel skulls bleached white, ribs poking up like the arches of ruined doorways, and the occasional human femur jutting out at an awkward angle. It feels like walking through a macabre breadcrumb trail, left not by fairy tale children, but by desperate travelers centuries before you. The desert doesn't erase everything, it preserves. And sometimes, what it preserves becomes a kind of map. Mainstream historical fact. Many caravan routes were marked, intentionally or not, by remains. When water ran out or storms swept a caravan off course, animals often dropped dead at predictable intervals. Those spots became warnings or even waypoints. Abandoned wells and ruined forts joined the skeletons, forming a grim but practical geography. Early explorers of the Sahara in the 19th century often followed these bone roads, noting that the remains stretched out for miles, pointing toward the nearest reliable oasis. You catch yourself glancing over your shoulder, half worried the bones might rearrange themselves like a trail of arrows while you're not looking. But no, these are desert hieroglyphs, fixed in place by sun and time. The guides don't even flinch. One of them taps a camel skull with his staff and mutters something under his breath, half prayer, half complaint. You can't decide whether he's blessing the dead or scolding them for being bad navigators. Quirky tidbit. There are stories of caravans deliberately leaving skeletons propped upright, as if to scare or warn others. Travelers wrote of eerie figures, dead men lashed against poles or camel bones arranged into crude signposts, pointing toward safety or sometimes toward doom. Were these gestures acts of kindness or desert pranks? Hard to say. In a landscape this brutal, even humor could be sharpened into survival. The guides steer you toward another kind of marker. The ruins of a stone cistern, crumbled but still visible above the sand. The stones are sun-baked, scarred with faint carvings. Someone centuries ago chiseled symbols into them, maybe a clan mark, maybe a warning, maybe just the desert equivalent of Kilroy was here. Historians still argue whether such ruins belong to empire-sponsored infrastructure, the kind the Mali Empire might have built to stabilize trade, or whether they were the collective work of countless small clans keeping routes alive. Whatever the truth, you're grateful they exist, because ruins don't wander the way dunes do. By noon, the caravan halts at another ruined fort, its walls no taller than your waist now, but enough to cast a square of shade. Everyone crowds in like penguins jostling for space, grateful for a tiny scrap of relief. You lean against a weathered stone and imagine the place alive, merchants hawking salt blocks, guards on the walls scanning the horizon for raiders, children splashing in a shallow well. The silence around you feels even louder after that daydream, as if the desert itself swallowed their voices. A sudden gust carries a rattling sound, bones clacking together like wind chimes. The camels groan, unsettled, and you shiver despite the heat. You realize the desert is speaking in two languages at once. The bones tell you where travelers have been, and the ruins whisper where they once thrived. Together, they're a map written in absence rather than presence. As the caravan moves on, the bones fade behind you, swallowed again by sand. But you carry them in your mind. Each skull, each ruin, each fragment is a signpost, grim, yes, but strangely reassuring. The desert doesn't just erase. It leaves scars, and those scars are how you know you're still on the path. That night, as you drift towards sleep, you picture the skeletal trail as glowing lanterns across the dunes, little beacons reminding you that you're not the first fool to walk this way, and hopefully not the last. The bones, oddly enough, have your back. You don't need parchment. You don't need ink. Out here, the map isn't drawn on paper. It's carried inside the mind, passed from lips to ears, tucked into the grooves of memory. The desert doesn't allow forgetfulness. If you slip, if you fail to recall the exact order of dunes, wells, and sun-tilted stones, you die. It's that simple, and that final. So you begin to realize the real navigational tool isn't the camel's stride or the ruined fort walls. It's the caravan guides themselves. Mainstream historical fact. In Africa's desert trade networks, routes were preserved through oral tradition. Generations of guides, called azalai in some regions, memorized distances between wells, landmarks, and seasonal hazards. Instead of written charts, they carried what scholars call mental maps, far more detailed than anything scribbled by European explorers centuries later. These mental atlases weren't just directions. They were survival manuals, remembering which well turned brackish in summer, which ridge shifted during sandstorms, and which tribe's territory might demand a toll. You watch your guide, an older man with a beard as white as salt, mumble to himself as he walks. At first you think he's praying, but after a while you realize he's reciting something like a poem. It goes in a steady rhythm. 3 days to the crooked acacia, 2 more to the ruined fort, half a day to the bitter spring. It's a song, a chant, a mnemonic. Quirky tidbit. In some places, traders literally sang their maps. Caravan songs weren't just for morale, they were navigational memory devices. Each verse marked a segment of the route, each rhyme tied to a landmark. Some even had nonsense rhymes thrown in simply because the silliness helped you remember better. Imagine trying to remember where the next well is, and all you can think of is, "Don't trust the donkey, he lies like the moon." Strange. Yes. Effective? Also yes. You catch yourself humming along, though you don't know the words. It's oddly soothing, as if the desert itself has a melody. Maybe that's the point. Turn danger into rhythm, fear into memory, silence into song. Historians still argue whether these oral maps were standardized across wide regions or jealously guarded by individual families. Some claim there were pan-Saharan master routes, known by many. Others suggest that each clan's knowledge was deliberately kept fragmented, ensuring outsiders could never fully copy the trade secrets. Either way, you notice how your guide pauses when a younger boy asks about a shortcut. His answer is vague, almost evasive, and you can't help but think he's holding something back. That evening, you share dried dates with another caravan hand, who tells you his grandfather could recite the entire journey from Timbuktu to Sigil Masa without pause. Not just the landmarks, but also the songs of the birds at each stop and the smell of the water in every well. He swears memory itself is the greatest inheritance in the desert. Lands erode, camels die, but knowledge passed mouth to ear lives longer than any empire. You find yourself testing your own memory. You close your eyes and replay the path so far. The crooked dunes, the scattered bones, the ruined cisterns, the shade square at the broken fort. Could you backtrack if you had to? Could you lead someone else? The thought makes you sweat harder than the desert sun. By the time the moon rises, you realize something strange. The caravan is less a moving line of camels than it is a moving library. Every step presses a story deeper into your mind. Every landmark slots into a rhythm you'll never quite shake. You're not just walking a path. You're memorizing a song older than parchment. And just maybe, if you survive, you'll be able to hum that song again someday. Proof that the desert map has taken root in you too. Night in the desert is supposed to be a navigator's blessing. Stars bright as lanterns, constellations like dotted highways painted across black velvet. But then comes the betrayal, a sandstorm. The sky vanishes. Not a single star survives the choking haze. You squint, but above you there's only a swirling soup of dust. The heavens are gone, and with them the trusty compass of the night. So what do? You walk by darkness itself. Mainstream historical fact. Caravans could travel even when the stars were hidden. They relied on temperature gradients and wind. As the desert cools rapidly at night, air currents shift. Guides learned to feel the faintest brush of breeze against their skin, telling them where the wind had settled during the day. Those who knew these invisible patterns could still keep direction when the sky betrayed them. You shuffle forward, trying it yourself. The breeze is so faint you almost think you're imagining it, but your guide insists. Keep your cheek turned, feel the cool side. It's like trying to smell a flavor of air. Ridiculous at first, but the more you pay attention, the more it makes sense. You feel the desert breathe in long, slow sighs, like it's whispering where to go. Quirky tidbit: some desert nomads believed the night itself had a directional taste. They would lick a finger and hold it up, not just for wind like hikers do today, but for tiny grains of dust. Finer grains carried by certain breezes meant you were oriented east. Heavier grit told you west. Imagine explaining that at a modern hiking workshop. Just lick the air, it works. The caravan presses on, camels snorting uneasily in the dark. You notice the silence grows heavier without stars. Normally, even their stillness offers reassurance, a pattern to cling to. Without them, it feels like walking through a void. And yet, your guide seems calm, as though the absence itself is useful. Historians still argue whether these night methods were truly systematic knowledge, or just intuitive guesswork refined by generations. Was it science, or was it instinct sharpened to a knife edge? Some scholars argue the temperature navigation idea is overstated, claiming it was more likely a blend of memory, wind, and luck. Others insist experienced guides absolutely recognized subtle nightly patterns invisible to outsiders. Either way, you realize this is a test of trust. Out here, you cannot second-guess every step. You have to lean into the invisible and believe in things you can't measure with tools. As you walk, you begin to notice other sensory clues. The sound of your own breath echoing differently when the ground firms, the faint smell of dust stronger in some directions than others. The desert becomes less empty and more alive. It's eerie, but also strangely comforting, like learning that the void has texture after all. At one point, you swear the darkness itself bends, dunes shifting against the moon's half-hidden glow. For a terrifying moment, you feel lost. But then, a cool current brushes your neck, tugging ever so slightly toward the east. The guide nods, muttering his quiet chant, and you follow. By dawn, when the sandstorm clears and stars return, you realize you've already covered miles in pitch black, led not by the heavens, but by the breath of the desert. You smile, half in relief, half in awe. Turns out darkness isn't empty, it's just another map, if you know how to read it. Morning comes with cruel brightness, the kind that makes your eyelids ache even when they're shut. The sun climbs quick and merciless, and with it, the ground begins to shimmer like a heated skillet. You squint, and suddenly the world isn't what it seems. Ahead, a sparkling lake spreads across the horizon, complete with palm trees and the promise of cool shade. You break into a grin, water. But the guide doesn't even look up. He keeps trudging. That's when you realize it's a mirage. Mainstream historical fact. Mirages were a constant companion to desert caravans. Caused by light bending through hot layers of air, these illusions often resembled pools of water, sometimes even resembling whole villages. Travelers new to the desert were notorious for chasing them, wasting strength and precious time. Experienced guides, however, trained themselves to recognize the trick instantly. The water was always too bright, too far, too perfect. You drag your feet, embarrassed. You know it's fake, but your thirsty brain still aches for it. The caravan passes several more shimmering lakes that vanish the moment you shift your gaze. It's maddening, like the desert is mocking you. Here's a quirky tidbit. Arab folklore contains stories of desert spirits deliberately crafting mirages to torment greedy or arrogant travelers. These spirits, called ghouls in some tales, would lure victims deeper into the dunes until they collapsed. Locals joked that if you ever thought you'd spotted a lake large enough to host a camel regatta, you should assume it was a trickster spirit laughing at you. You start to notice how the guides fight illusion with pattern. One explains that real oases almost always appear flanked by green on the edges, even faint hints of scrub or bird flight overhead. If you see water without green, it's a lie. Another rule: if the water shifts with your movement, it's an illusion. If it stays steady, maybe just maybe it's real. Historians still argue whether mirages actually led whole caravans astray, or whether the stories exaggerate for dramatic effect. Some records claim entire trade groups perished after following false water, but skeptics say skilled desert guides would never be so easily fooled. Perhaps it was inexperienced pilgrims, not hardened traders, who succumbed most often. Still, the danger was real enough that mirage lore became woven into desert culture. Poets compared false love to desert mirages. Merchants used the metaphor to warn apprentices about easy profits. If it shines too bright, it's probably sand. You chuckle. Turns out bad investment advice hasn't changed much. As the day stretches, you grow oddly grateful for the mirages. Sure, they lie, but they also break the monotony of endless beige dunes. They make you squint, wonder, second guess. At least the desert gives you puzzles to play with, even if it's laughing at your expense. By dusk, when the illusions fade and the real stars return, you're left with a strange thought. Sometimes surviving isn't about seeing truth. It's about knowing when to ignore what looks too good to be true. And honestly, that lesson feels useful far beyond the desert. The desert by day is a trial of thirst and deception, but by night, something stranger happens. You start hearing things. At first, it's just the hiss of sand shifting in the wind. Then it deepens, a low hum that seems to come from the dunes themselves. You pause, unnerved, and the guide grins knowingly. The desert talks, he says. Mainstream historical fact: sand dunes can sing. Certain slopes, when disturbed, release a deep, resonant hum or boom, sometimes loud enough to be heard for miles. Marco Polo himself wrote of deserts that roared like drums when winds stirred them. Bedouin travelers knew these eerie sounds well, and often described them as the voices of unseen beings. You kneel, scoop a handful of sand, and let it trickle. The grains fall silently, but when the camel ahead lumbers over a ridge, the entire dune groans like a giant cello string being plucked. It's unsettling, like the earth itself is complaining about your intrusion. Quirky tidbit: Some nomads believed these sounds were the whispering of jinn, the spirits of the desert. According to legend, the hum carried warnings. A booming dune could mean danger ahead, or even signal the presence of buried treasure guarded by supernatural forces. There's a story of one unlucky merchant who tried to dig where the sand sang the loudest, only for his camels to stampede in terror, scattering his goods. Treasure or not, the desert clearly had its own way of saying, "Don't touch." Historians still argue whether desert guides actually used these sounds as navigational cues, or whether they were just eerie coincidences woven into folklore. Some scholars suggest that dunes which consistently sang may have acted like acoustic landmarks. Others think the noise was too unpredictable, more likely to spook travelers than guide them. The debate continues, like the echo of the dunes themselves. As you keep walking, you notice how the sound shifts with terrain. Smaller dunes sigh softly, almost like the snoring of a restless sleeper. Larger ridges produce low, trembling rumbles that vibrate through your sandals. Before long, you're half convinced the desert really is alive, grumbling at every footstep. The guides, of course, treat it casually. One even cracks a joke. If the dune sings, it means we're not lost, it's just bored. You laugh, though it doesn't erase the goosebumps prickling your arms. There's something strangely comforting about it, too. In a place so vast and silent, even a booming dune feels like company. Hours later, when camp is set and the fire flickers, you still hear the hum in your head. It's like the sound has seeped into your bones, a reminder that even in its emptiness, the desert has a voice. You sip your water ration, stare at the endless night, and realize the truth. Silence isn't the absence of sound. It's just waiting for you to listen closely enough. You wake to the smell of leather and sweat, and the sound of bells. The camels are being loaded again, their packs stacked high with bundles tied in neat knots. You notice something you hadn't paid attention to before. Not all the animals carry trade goods. Some are packed with nothing but skins, jars, and bags of water. These are the real lifeline of the caravan, the mobile wells. Mainstream historical fact: caravans crossing the Sahara were carefully planned around water transport. A single camel could carry up to 200 liters, but much of that water wasn't for humans. It was for the camels themselves. Successful crossings depended on balancing trade cargo with liquid survival. Many routes were mapped not by distance, but by how far the animals could march before needing to drink again, often 7 to 10 days. As you trudge alongside, you see how strict the rationing is. A cup at dawn, a mouthful at midday, another in the evening. That's it. Even when your tongue feels like sandpaper and your throat burns, you're told to wait. You learn the cruel truth. Water in the desert isn't about comfort, it's about mathematics. Quirky tidbit: some caravans carried emergency water, sealed in goat stomachs, the skins tied so tightly they could be buried under dunes without spoiling. Travelers swore the water from these buried skins tasted faintly of goat even years later, but no one complained. In a pinch, even goat-flavored mud water could mean the difference between life and death. The guide explains how the group reads the land for water clues. The presence of certain trees, like acacia or date palms, often signals a hidden water table. Darker patches in the sand might mean underground moisture. And most surprising to you, they watch the behavior of animals. Birds flying low at dusk often betray the location of hidden springs. Historians still argue whether desert caravans were truly at the mercy of wells, or whether their complex knowledge of underground cisterns gave them more security than we assume. Some say the image of desperate caravans clinging to rare oases is romantic exaggeration, while others insist water shortages were the greatest constant threat. The truth, as always, probably lies somewhere in between. You also learn the art of thirst management. Cover your mouth with cloth so you lose less moisture with each breath. Walk slowly, because sweat is a luxury you can't afford. One older merchant laughs when you try to sneak an extra sip. Drink too much now, and you'll be crying dust later, he warns. It's dark humor, but he's not wrong. By midday, when the sun is merciless, you notice the rhythm of drinking becomes almost ceremonial. A camel driver fills a small cup, passes it carefully down the line, and each person sips, no more than a mouthful, before handing it on. The shared restraint binds the caravan tighter than rope. Everyone is thirsty, but everyone waits together. And in that strange, dry solidarity, you understand. Water isn't just survival here. It's trust, discipline, and patience made liquid. Lose track of that, and no star or compass in the world will save you. The desert doesn't forgive those who mistake it for a blank canvas. From afar, the Sahara looks like an endless monotony of beige, but once you've been walking in it for days, you begin to notice the palette is anything but dull. Each horizon is painted in subtle variations of gold, rust, gray, and white. And though the landscape seems empty, the very shape of the sand holds secrets that the experienced guide reads like a book. Tonight, you learn the strange art of dune navigation. At first glance, every dune looks the same, a towering ridge of sand sculpted by the wind. But your guide points to one and says, "Look carefully. The dune is telling you the direction." You squint, baffled, until he explains. The long, gentle slope of the dune faces the prevailing wind. The steep slope, called the slip face, forms on the sheltered side. These angles act like arrows scattered across the desert floor. Mainstream historical fact: Barkhan Dunes, those crescent-shaped ridges with horns pointing downwind, were among the most important guides for caravans. Even without stars, merchants could follow the shape of these dunes to confirm direction. Whole trade routes through Mauritania and Mali were charted with these formations as waypoints. As you climb one dune, your calves burning, you notice how the sand feels different depending on which side you step. The windward slope is firm, tightly packed, as if the grains have been pressed flat by the constant breath of the desert. The slip face, however, collapses under your weight, sending you sliding back down with a hiss of tumbling grains. The guide chuckles. "Now you've met the dune's temper," he says. You sit, spitting sand out of your teeth, and realize something eerie. The dunes are moving. Not fast, not in ways the eye can catch, but shifting, creeping across the desert day by day. That's the unsettling truth. The landmarks here are alive. Historians still argue whether this moving landscape made the dunes reliable guides or unreliable traps. Some claim experienced merchants could always read them accurately, while others suggest travelers were just as often led astray when winds shifted. The truth is, you can't trust a dune forever, only long enough to get you through the present leg of the journey. Quirky tidbit: in some oral traditions, dunes were thought of as sleeping giants. Their ridges were the backs of massive creatures buried beneath the sand. Their movement explained not by wind, but by the beasts stirring restlessly in their slumber. One Tuareg tale even describes a caravan swallowed whole because the giant rolled over. A terrifying story, yes, but also a sly way of reminding travelers that dunes are never still. As the day heats up, you learn the skill of measuring shadows on dunes. The guide demonstrates. Stick a staff upright in the sand, watch the shadow crawl, and note the dune ridges that align with it. This, combined with wind direction, gave ancient merchants a natural compass. No brass instruments, no polished glass, just sticks, shadows, and shifting sand. The dunes aren't all the same either. Some are low and crescent-shaped, others stretch for miles in great waves called seefs. You trudge along a knife-edge crest of one, your sandals threatening to slide down either side. The guide calls it walking the dragon's spine. From up there, the world looks like an ocean-frozen midwave, endless golden breakers rolling to the horizon. But even beauty has its dangers. A younger camel stumbles, sliding down the slip face with a load of salt slabs clattering behind it. The sound echoes like thunder. Everyone rushes to calm the animal before it panics and bolts. You learn that dunes can collapse in small avalanches, swallowing gear in seconds. The desert isn't just about thirst, it's about balance, footing, and never letting gravity take you by surprise. By evening, when the heat fades into cool blue shadows, you notice how the dunes glow in moonlight. The pale sand seems to shimmer, reflecting the light in soft silver waves. You walk in near silence, the only sound your feet crunching softly like snow. It feels almost dreamlike, as though you've wandered into another world where the ground itself has turned to liquid light. The guide stops suddenly, points at the horizon, and grins. "See that?" he asks. You squint. At first it looks like nothing, just more ridges. But then you notice one dune gleaming whiter than the others. That's not a trick of light. It's gypsum, a different mineral, marking a rare kind of dune that merchants use as a landmark. For a caravan, that patch of bright sand is like a road sign saying, "You're on track." You think back to the first time you stared at this desert, convinced it was formless. Now you see how much there is to read. The curves of the dunes, their colors, their angles, even their moods. It's like learning a new alphabet, each grain of sand a letter in a vast, shifting script. Later, lying in your tent, you replay the day's lessons in your head. You picture dunes as arrows, as compasses, as restless giants sliding across the Sahara. You realize that in a place with no rivers, no forests, no mountains, the only guides left are these restless waves of earth. And the merchants who crossed them didn't just survive by endurance. They survived by listening to the silent language of the sand itself. And then you chuckle, remembering the guide's offhand joke earlier. A dune is like a camel. You can't trust it not to spit, but you can trust it to walk in the same direction for a while. By now, you've learned that crossing the desert is as much about listening as it is about walking. Tonight, you notice the hush of the Sahara isn't truly silence. It's punctuated by whispers of wind, the crunch of sand, and the occasional low groan of a camel. But listen closer, your guide insists, and you'll hear something else, the desert itself speaking in sound. This is where you encounter the eerie phenomenon of singing sand. At first, you think someone is playing a distant flute. But no, when the caravan descends the slope of a tall dune, the sand beneath your feet begins to hum. A deep, vibrating drone rolls through the ground, like a giant plucking invisible strings beneath the surface. You freeze, wide-eyed, convinced the desert is alive and singing to you. Mainstream historical fact. This acoustic marvel has been documented in places like Morocco, Oman, and even parts of China. Ancient caravans would sometimes hear these booming dunes at night, the resonance triggered by the cascading of grains. The sound could travel for miles, an unearthly bass note rolling across the emptiness. Merchants sometimes used these sounds to orient themselves. If you heard a singing dune, you knew where you were because only certain regions produced them. Quirky tidbit. In some Berber folklore, the dunes that sang were thought to be haunted by jinn. The voices weren't wind or sand at all, but restless spirits trying to lure the unwary off their path. A common warning was, if the desert sings, don't answer back. Which, honestly, is pretty solid life advice no matter where you are. Historians still argue whether caravans truly used sound as a consistent navigational aid, or whether it was more of a spooky coincidence folded into oral storytelling. Some insist seasoned traders memorized which dunes made which noises. Others argue that the phenomenon is too rare and unpredictable to have been practical. You don't know who's right, but you can't deny the memory of that vibrating hum sinking into your bones. Walking at night, you begin noticing smaller clues in sound. The difference between the crunch of dry sand and the squeak of slightly damp grains. The distant rustle that signals scrub brush, or less comfortingly, another creature moving in the dark. The camels make their own steady rhythm, groans, snorts, and the jangle of bells tied to their necks. A caravan is never silent. It's like a living orchestra trudging across the dunes. Your guide even demonstrates a simple trick. Clap your hands sharply and listen for the echo. In rocky regions, the sound bounces back, letting you gauge how far away the cliffs are. In open sand seas, there's no echo at all, just the soft gulp of silence. Imagine relying on that when visibility drops to nothing in a dust storm. It's eerie, but also ingenious. Then there's the wind itself. The desert is a massive, shifting flute, and every ridge changes the tune. The whistling pitch of air slicing over the crest of a dune can reveal wind direction. Long ago, travelers would lie flat and listen, using their ears as compasses. You try it yourself, pressing your cheek into the cool sand, eyes closed. At first you feel silly, but then you notice. Yes, the sound is sharper on one side, lower on the other. It's a crude compass, but a compass nonetheless. Your guide shares a joke that feels like it's been told for centuries. If the desert is quiet, you're lost. If it's noisy, you're in danger. So either way, keep walking. Everyone laughs, but the truth in it isn't lost on you. The strangest sound arrives one evening when you're resting. At the edge of camp, a low rumble seems to creep from nowhere, growing louder until it rattles the ground. You leap up, heart racing, convinced it's an earthquake. But the guide shakes his head calmly. No, just sand. And he's right. A dune nearby has collapsed in a slow avalanche, releasing a roar like thunder. For a few terrifying minutes, the desert sounds like the sky tearing apart. Then silence. You sit back down, shaken, realizing again how alive this place is. You came expecting silence, but instead, the Sahara is a soundscape, a vast, shifting symphony of grains, wind, and echoes. Navigation here isn't just a matter of sight or touch. It's also about hearing where you are. And maybe that's why, when you lie down to sleep, you catch yourself listening harder than ever before. The faint whistle of sand, the creak of leather straps, the steady snore of a camel. It's like the desert is giving you a lullaby. Strange, unsettling, but oddly comforting too. You chuckle to yourself, remembering one last aside the guide made. If you hear a tune you can hum, you've gone mad. If you hear a tune the camels hum back, well, then we're all in trouble. You wake to a desert morning that feels less like a sunrise and more like someone has swapped out the entire world while you were asleep. The stars are gone, the air is already warm, and the dunes look different, almost like they've moved in the night. And in a way, they have. Here's the cruel secret. The desert is never the same 2 days in a row. Your guide grins knowingly when you ask if the sands shift overnight. Of course, he says, shrugging, as if it's no big deal that entire landscapes rearrange themselves while you nap. A dune you used yesterday as a landmark may now be a flattened ridge. That canyon you thought you'd memorized? Filled in. It's like someone picked up the Sahara and gave it a good shake. Mainstream historical fact. These are ergs, massive seas of dunes that can stretch for hundreds of kilometers, shaped by seasonal winds. Caravans didn't just memorize them. They learned the broader wind systems that sculpted them. Traders from places like Timbuktu or Gadams knew that dunes leaned a certain way depending on the prevailing wind, and that gave them a clue which direction they were facing. Quirky tidbit. Some travelers swore they could tell when dunes had shifted by smell. After a sandstorm, the freshly uncovered grains apparently released a faint, mineral-rich aroma, almost metallic, which seasoned noses claimed could reveal whether they were near a familiar landmark. You try sniffing the sand yourself. Result: you sneeze violently and get laughed at by the entire caravan. Historians still argue whether merchants truly had a system for tracking dune migration or if they just rolled with the chaos, recalibrating every morning. Some accounts suggest elaborate oral maps describing how dunes tended to walk across valleys. Others insist no such system could ever be reliable. Every caravan had to improvise daily. As you walk, you notice your guide often stops, squints at the ground, and then picks up a handful of sand. He lets it fall slowly between his fingers. At first, you think he's being dramatic, like some desert philosopher posing for a painting. But then you realize he's watching how the grains drift in the breeze. The sand itself is a compass, its flight betraying the tiniest shifts in wind. By midday, the dunes start playing tricks on your eyes. You swear you see the same shape repeating, like the world is stuck in a loop. A ridge here, a hollow there, then another ridge that looks uncannily like the first. You can't help but mutter, "I'm walking on an endless treadmill of sand." Your guide just smirks and says, "Congratulations. Now you're truly in the Sahara." Navigation here becomes a game of memory, but not in the way you're used to. It's not about memorizing one fixed landscape. It's about memorizing how things change. The caravan elders recall how a ridge has shifted since the last time they crossed. They note how a dune line now curves differently than last season. It's like tracking a living creature that grows and molts. That evening, one of the younger guides tells a legend. Dunes are the spines of sleeping giants buried under the desert. When they roll in their dreams, the earth above them ripples. That's why nothing here stays still. Everyone chuckles, but as you glance at the endless waves of sand glowing under the moon, you half believe it. Even your camel seems to sense the changeability. She hesitates at spots where yesterday she walked confidently, as though remembering an old path that no longer exists. Animals, too, must relearn the desert with each journey. You can't help but admire the resilience it takes, not just to endure this place, but to constantly update your inner map of a world that refuses to stay put. The joke among merchants goes, if you draw a map of the dunes, by tomorrow it's art, not geography. Which is funny until you realize you're currently standing in the middle of that problem. No paper, no GPS, just a landscape that rewrites itself daily. And yet, somehow you keep moving forward. The trick isn't resisting the desert's mutability. It's flowing with it, letting your senses, your guide, and your camel adapt as naturally as breathing. You're not conquering the desert. You're learning to dance with its shifting skin. By now, your days and nights are blending together like sand and wind. You walk, you eat gritty bread that tastes faintly of dust, you doze on your camel, and then you walk again. What surprises you isn't just the monotony, it's how your brain slowly begins to adjust. The desert no longer feels alien, exactly. It feels sly, like it's testing you. And the test today is mirages. The first time you see one, you're convinced salvation is only a few hundred steps away. A shining pool of water ripples in the hollow of a dune, reflecting the sky so vividly you could swear you see palm trees swaying above it. Your throat, raw from dryness, practically begs you to sprint toward it. But your guide chuckles and says, the desert's favorite joke. Mainstream fact. Mirages are optical illusions caused by layers of heated air bending light. In the Sahara, the ground can reach temperatures over 70 degrees Celsius, 158 degrees Fahrenheit. That heat warps light rays so they curve upward, creating images of sky and water on the sand. Traders knew these tricks and trained themselves not to chase them, no matter how convincing. Quirky tidbit. There are stories of entire phantom caravans shimmering on the horizon. Strings of camels and figures that dissolve as you approach. Some desert travelers swore these weren't mirages at all, but spirits reenacting old journeys. One folktale even insists a lost caravan is doomed to walk forever as a mirage, tricking future wanderers with its ghostly parade. Historians still argue whether ancient guides developed rituals to ward off mirages. A few sources mention caravan leaders tossing small offerings, dates, water skins, or even carved amulets, before moving on, as though appeasing the desert for its cruel humor. Skeptics say this was just folklore grafted onto the science of heat refraction. Still, when you see an oasis rippling in the distance, you half wish for a pocketful of amulets yourself. The mirages mess with your mind more than you expect. You begin doubting everything. Is that really a dune? Or will it vanish when you get closer? You wonder if your camel is real, if your guide is real, if you are real. You joke to yourself that maybe you are someone else's mirage right now. The heat has you sliding toward philosophy, which is never a good sign when you're thirsty. To cope, caravans developed methods of testing reality. One simple trick. Shade your eyes and focus not on the shimmer, but on the edges of what you see. Real palms cast shadows. Real water glistens only in certain directions. Illusions, no matter how convincing, lack weight. You try it and realize, sure enough, that glorious oasis has no shadow at all. It's a watercolor painted by the sky. By late afternoon, the mirages become less about thirst and more about mockery. You swear you see entire cities floating ahead, minarets and domes glittering in the haze. The illusion is almost comforting. At least the desert is offering a little imagination. Your guide quips, if you're going to hallucinate, may as well hallucinate somewhere with good architecture. Nightfall finally relieves you. The mirages vanish as quickly as they appeared, replaced by the honest glow of moon and stars. You almost feel grateful for their trickery, though, because once you've survived a day of chasing ghosts, the real world of firelit camp and shared water tastes all the sweeter. And here's the quiet lesson you take from it. The desert never lies outright. It only bends light, reshapes memory, and makes you doubt yourself. But if you learn to look harder, to question, to test, to keep walking despite the visions, you pass the test. Navigation isn't just about finding the way forward. It's about not getting lost inside your own hopes and illusions. Your camel snorts like she agrees. Or maybe she's laughing at you, just like the desert does. The desert has a memory. You can feel it as your camel lumbers over a landscape that looks, to your untrained eye, like the same endless sweep of dunes as yesterday. But your guide stops, kneels, and brushes away a thin veil of sand. Beneath the top layer lies something unexpected. Cracked clay, the faint outline of a dry riverbed stretching out into the horizon. You blink at it, because it seems impossible. A river here? Yet your guide nods, as though he has just opened a history book buried beneath the sand. Mainstream fact: the Sahara hasn't always been desert. 10,000 years ago, much of it was green, filled with lakes, grasslands, and rivers. Scientists call this the African humid period, when monsoon rains shifted northward, transforming today's wasteland into a lush savanna. Fossil riverbeds, known as wadis, still crisscross the desert, invisible from above until erosion or a sandstorm reveals their paths. Traders later discovered these ancient scars and used them like highways, following their gentle slopes across otherwise featureless terrain. You trail your hand across the hardened surface. It feels different from dune sand, smoother, flatter, like a natural road. For caravans, this was a gift. When the sands confused or swallowed tracks, these fossil rivers provided a guide you could trust. You might walk for days without seeing a landmark, but a dry riverbed always knows where it is going. Downhill, toward some vanished basin or ancient lake. Quirky tidbit: some guides swore these fossil rivers carried whispers. On still nights, they claimed you could hear water rushing beneath, even though no drop had flowed for thousands of years. Travelers told tales of phantom fish scales glittering under moonlight, or crocodile spirits basking in invisible shallows. One Moroccan folktale warns of a sand hippopotamus, a creature said to erupt from a fossil channel and swallow unwary wanderers whole. Rationally, you know it's just the desert playing tricks again. Still, when your camel sidesteps nervously, as if something lingers under the clay, you shiver. Historians still argue whether these fossil waterways were deliberately mapped by ancient traders or rediscovered by chance. Some suggest early pastoralists remembered them through oral tradition, singing about rivers of stone that their grandchildren later followed with herds and caravans. Others argue that guides noticed the consistent orientation of the dried channels and slowly pieced together a mental network. Either way, by the time trans-Saharan trade flourished, fossil rivers were part of the invisible skeleton holding the routes together. You keep walking, and suddenly navigation feels different. Instead of measuring dunes, counting camel steps, or doubting mirages, you're on an ancient road carved by water long gone. There's a strange comfort in it, like following an old railway track through a ghost town. The surface beneath your camel's hooves is firm, smoother than loose sand, and you realize why caravans sought these paths. Fewer broken ankles, fewer collapsed pack animals, fewer days wasted wandering. The irony isn't lost on you. Water carved these routes, and now, centuries later, the absence of water makes them useful again. The desert is one big recycling project. Every era leaves behind scraps for the next to scavenge. You wonder what our time will leave behind. Highways, plastic bottles, satellite coordinates. Maybe one day, someone will walk over the cracked asphalt of an abandoned freeway and think, "Ah, this was once a road of giants." Your guide begins telling you about Timbuktu, that half-legendary city which drew caravans from every corner of the desert. Many routes leading there followed these fossil rivers. Traders brought gold, salt, ivory. even manuscripts across terrain that to outsiders looked utterly hopeless. The dry riverbeds made it possible, linking salt mines in the north to marketplaces along the Niger. You imagine lines of camels trudging exactly where you're trudging now, feet sinking into the same clay, long before compasses or maps. By midday, heat shimmers rise from the old riverbed, making it look almost alive again. The mirages play tricks, turning the flat clay into a stream, then a lake, then a rippling ocean. You laugh out loud. It's as if the desert is showing you a flashback reel, reminding you what this place once was. For a second, you think you see fish darting under the surface. Your guide raises an eyebrow and asks if you're hallucinating yet. You tell him you are, but in a good way. Caravans didn't just use the riverbeds for direction. They also dug shallow wells in their basins. Some fossil valleys still hold groundwater beneath the sand, trapped from wetter millennia. Finding one meant survival. You picture dozens of men scraping with bowls and shovels, camels crowding impatiently, while everyone prays that a few drops seep up through the dust. The wells might last a season, then vanish, forcing caravans to gamble on which ancient channels still hid water. As the sun tilts lower, the dry river widens. You find yourself walking in what feels like a massive boulevard. The dunes rise like walls on either side, and you can almost imagine you're in the main street of a forgotten city. The thought comforts you, though it's bittersweet. Every step is haunted by absence, the absence of water, of people, of life. The desert is a vast graveyard, and the fossil rivers are its bones. But bones, as you realize, are useful. There's structure, memory, continuity. And following them is an act of respect, like treading carefully along the ribs of the world. Night comes. You pitch camp on the hard clay, where fires burn steadier than on shifting dunes. The stars return overhead, clear and sharp, and you stretch out on your mat. The cracked riverbed beneath you is cool against your back. You close your eyes and listen. At first, you hear nothing but the wind rattling tent flaps. Then something else. A low, rushing sigh, faint as breath. Is it just the wind funneled through dunes? Or is it, just maybe, the sound of a river still flowing deep in the earth, whispering its forgotten song? You don't know, but you fall asleep believing in it anyway. And that's the quiet genius of these caravans. They didn't just survive by memorizing dunes or sniffing water. They walked inside time itself, finding the ghost of a greener world and letting it lead them forward. Fossil rivers became more than just paths. They were proof that the desert hadn't always been desert, that life could change, vanish, and maybe one day return. Your last thought before sleep. Maybe the sand remembers everything. And maybe, just maybe, the sand is remembering you. You wake to a sky washed pale with dawn. The cracked clay of the fossil river feels cold beneath you, almost damp, as though it's keeping secrets. Your guide is already awake, crouched near the fire, rolling dates between his fingers. He gestures with his chin toward the horizon. There, faint against the golden haze, you notice something remarkable, low dark smudges, almost like bruises on the sky. You squint. They aren't dunes, not mountains. They're trees. That's when it hits you. You're nearing an oasis. Mainstream fact. Oases were the lifeblood of desert caravans. These patches of greenery, nourished by underground springs or aquifers, dotted the Sahara like stepping stones. Towns like Gadams, Siwa, and Kufra became vital caravan hubs precisely because of their water supply. Without oases, trans-Saharan trade on the scale we know would have been impossible. Every salt slab carried, every roll of cloth, every book bound for Timbuktu depended on these watery sanctuaries. From afar, though, an oasis isn't always obvious. A cluster of date palms might look like a mirage. Sometimes they were mirages. Travelers trudged toward shimmering groves only to find nothing but heat-rippled sand. But real oases had signs. Migrating birds circling, dragonflies skimming air, even faint breezes carrying the scent of damp earth. Experienced guides developed a sixth sense for spotting these havens long before thirsty amateurs could. You shade your eyes and watch as the smudges sharpen into slender palm trunks, their fronds lifting lazily in the wind. Water, shade, fruit, it all waits for you there. Your camel perks up too, plodding faster, sensing what lies ahead. You can't help but feel relief spread through your chest. If fossil rivers were ghosts of the past, then oases are miracles of the present. Quirky tidbit: caravans had strict etiquette at oases. Some records suggest arriving traders weren't allowed to rush in and guzzle water. Instead, leaders negotiated access, sometimes paying tolls or exchanging gifts. And don't forget the superstition. Some Berber groups whispered that oases were guarded by jinn, spirits who might bless you with abundance or curse you with drought if you disrespected the grove. That's why a few caravans made offerings before drinking. A handful of salt, a splash of milk, even a string of beads tied around a palm trunk. It was desert insurance, and honestly, you'd probably do the same. Historians still argue whether oases developed naturally or through early human engineering. Some evidence shows ancient people dug deep wells and used irrigation to expand green patches beyond their natural limits. Others believe many oases are accidents of geology, places where underground water simply seeped upward. The truth may lie somewhere in between. Nature provided the spring, humans coaxed it into a garden. By late morning, you're close enough to hear it, the faint gurgle of water in channels carved between the palms. The sound is almost too sweet, like hearing laughter after days of silence. The caravan quickens, and before you know it, you're standing in shade, the world suddenly transformed. The air here is cool, fragrant with dates ripening above. You dip your hand into a shallow pool, and the shock of cold makes you gasp. It's better than wine, better than sleep. Around you, the oasis bustles. Women in bright wraps fill clay jars. Children chase one another between trunks. Merchants spread cloths on the ground, already turning shade into marketplace. Your guide nods to another caravan master, and they embrace like brothers. That's another thing about oases. They weren't just water stops. They were information exchanges, rumor mills, cultural crossroads. News of wars, trade opportunities, even gossip about distant kings traveled along these green veins faster than a camel could run. You lean back against a trunk, munching on a handful of dates. They're sticky sweet, almost caramel-like. No wonder dates were a staple of caravan life. They stored well, gave energy, and grew in clusters large enough to feed hundreds. The palm wasn't just a tree, it was practically a survival kit. Its wood built shelters, its fronds wove mats, its fruit filled bellies. If fossil rivers were bones, then oases were beating hearts. Evening falls. Lanterns flicker among the palms, and the oasis takes on a dreamlike glow. You wander past low mud brick houses, where smoke curls from cooking fires. A storyteller sits cross-legged near the water, surrounded by children, his voice carrying tales of desert spirits, heroic traders, and magical wells that never ran dry. You pause to listen, smiling. Somewhere behind you, your camel groans as it finally settles into the soft sand. And you realize something important. Navigation wasn't only about knowing where to go. It was about knowing where to pause. Fossil rivers guided movement, but oases demanded stillness. Caravans could measure progress not in miles, but in how many oases lay between them and their destination. In a desert that punishes excess, these little green worlds taught patience, generosity, and restraint. You stretch out by the pool, cool stone against your back. The water reflects the stars, and for the first time in days, you don't feel parched. You feel safe, anchored. Tomorrow, you'll trudge back into the endless dunes, following ghost rivers and reading sand once more. But tonight, you rest in a pocket of grace carved into the Sahara's vast hostility. And maybe, just maybe, you wonder if the jinn are smiling. You wake before dawn, the oasis still hushed in shadow. Palms rustle faintly, and the pool mirrors the pale shimmer of the sky. The coolness clings to your skin, but you know it won't last. Heat is always waiting, crouched just beyond the horizon. The caravan stirs, ropes creak, camels grunt, and the spell of still water is broken. Leaving an oasis feels like walking away from paradise. Your lips want one more sip, your hands one more handful of dates, but the desert doesn't tolerate hesitation. So you pack up, sling your satchel, and step back onto the track. Within minutes, the air thickens and dries, swallowing the memory of shade. Mainstream fact: beyond oases, another ancient survival system waits: qanats. These underground tunnels, pioneered in Persia but adapted across North Africa, tapped aquifers and carried water along gently sloping channels to settlements and fields. From above, you'd only notice small, round shafts, like a string of beads across the desert. But beneath your feet ran lifelines. Some qanats stretched for kilometers, providing water even in blistering summers. Entire caravan towns relied on them, combining nature's gift with human engineering. You trudge past a line of such shafts now, stone rims baked by centuries of sun. Your guide explains how travelers knew which shafts still connected to flowing water. A faint coolness rose from the opening, or moss clung stubbornly to the edges. The knowledge was passed like family recipes, guarded yet shared when survival demanded it. Quirky tidbit: some locals swore qanats were built by supernatural helpers. After all, how could mere men dig for miles through rock without collapsing tunnels? The myth claimed that jinn, tricked or bribed, hollowed the earth in secret. Of course, the truth was less magical but no less impressive. Entire communities coordinated, rotating laborers, inventing clever ventilation methods, and maintaining the channels for generations. Historians still argue whether qanats were more efficient than open wells for caravans. Wells were simpler, visible, and easy to guard. But qanats provided cleaner, cooler water shielded from evaporation. Some scholars believe qanats fueled the growth of caravan boomtowns, while others think they were too resource-intensive for most trade routes. The debate hangs unresolved, much like the dry shafts dotting the sands. You kneel at one rim, peering down into darkness. A breath of air wafts up, startlingly cool, smelling faintly of wet stone. You imagine crawling inside, torch in hand, following that hidden artery until it emerges in a village garden lush with cucumbers, melons, or barley. It's like the desert whispering, life is stubborn. Life will find a way. As the caravan moves, you notice how water, or its promise, shaped every path. Fossil rivers guided the old ways. Oases offered rest, qanats stitched invisible veins underfoot. To travel the desert was less about straight lines and more about weaving between water's hiding places. Every choice, every risk, bent around thirst. By midday, the sun hammers down merciless. The memory of cool shafts feels like a cruel joke. Your camel trudges slower, tongue lolling. Sweat prickles your spine, drying almost as soon as it forms. You lick your lips, but they crack. And then, you hear it. Not water this time. Music. A thin, reedy sound, carried by wind. At first you think you're imagining it, some mirage of the ears. But your guide lifts his head, smiling faintly. Flute, he says. Sure enough, cresting the next dune reveals a cluster of travelers resting under a tattered canopy. One man plays a wooden flute, coaxing a melody that curls like smoke in the heat. Music was another kind of oasis. Caravans didn't just march in silence. They sang. Drums, flutes, rattles, all found their way into the sands. Songs marked rhythm, lifted spirits, kept people awake during endless night treks. Some lyrics praised ancestors, others mocked rival tribes, and some, your favorite, were just nonsense verses designed to make weary men laugh. Imagine trudging under the sun while chanting about a camel who refused to burp until he was promised an extra date. You collapse near the players, grateful for shade. Someone passes you a bowl of water, lukewarm but heavenly. The tune rises and falls, a little ragged but hypnotic. You realize sound itself was another compass in the desert. It broke monotony, mapped time, reminded the weary they weren't alone. Later, as you march again, the memory of the flute lingers, and you picture qanats stretching under the sand. Hidden music, a melody of stone and water, playing silently for centuries. The desert is a master of illusions, but sometimes its gifts are real. You rise in the pale hush before sunrise, when the world is still bluish and forgiving, when shadows stretch long and you can almost pretend the desert is gentle. The caravan leader wastes no time. He orders everyone forward because traveling early means surviving. You mount your camel, shifting on the rough saddle, and the caravan lurches onward into another day of heat and uncertainty. At first, the air is cool, the sand crisp underfoot, as though last night's chill has pressed it flat. But you know this is only an intermission, like the quiet between thunderclaps. The sun is climbing, the heat waiting, and ahead lies another trial, the sandstorm. Mainstream fact: Saharan caravans often dreaded haboobs, massive walls of sand whipped into the sky by sudden winds. Historical records describe storms blotting out the sun for hours, burying entire paths, even swallowing camel trains whole. Medieval geographers warned about them as if describing dragons, monstrous, unpredictable, and all-consuming. One 14th century traveler, Ibn Battuta, described riding for hours with his face wrapped tight, unable to see more than the tail of the camel before him. The horizon trembles. At first, you think it's heat haze. But then the line thickens, darkens, and begins to move. A brown wall, silent at first, rolling toward you with terrifying inevitability. The guide barks orders: cover your face, tie the ropes, kneel the camels. Everyone scrambles. Cloth wraps tight across mouths. Eyes squint behind slitted veils. The animals grunt and fold into the sand, instinct older than memory. The wall hits with a scream. Wind claws at you, ripping at your robe. Sand pelts your skin like 1,000 tiny whips. The air tastes of grit, dry and suffocating. You crouch low, clinging to the saddle's edge, every breath a battle. Quirky tidbit: some desert tribes once believed sandstorms were angry spirits racing across the dunes, punishing travelers who disrespected the land. To appease them, they muttered charms into the storm, spitting 3 times into the sand or waving amulets tied with bits of hair. You catch a glimpse of an older merchant in your caravan doing just that, mumbling furiously, talisman clutched in trembling hands. Whether superstition or comfort, who's to judge? You're tempted to try it yourself. Historians still argue whether caravans deliberately sought shelter before storms, or simply endured them. Records are vague, often romanticized. Some scholars insist experienced guides could sense changes in wind and smell the approach hours before. Others think this is legend, insisting that storms often struck without warning, leaving caravans helpless. Either way, survival was less about avoidance and more about resilience. The storm rages for what feels like forever, time swallowed in the roar. You lose sense of direction, up, down, east, west. Everything is the same shade of choking brown. Your throat burns, your ears fill, your skin grinds raw beneath your wrappings. You close your eyes and imagine you've turned into a dune yourself, waiting for the storm to sculpt you into some strange monument. And then silence. Just as suddenly as it came, the storm passes. The wind dies to a sigh, the air clears, and the sun slices back through the haze. The world looks alien. Sand piled high in new ridges, tracks erased, the landscape reshaped. Your guide spits grit, laughs dryly, and announces, "We walk by smell now." Half a joke, half the truth. You stumble up, brushing off layers of sand. Your camel shakes itself like an oversized dog, spraying grit everywhere. Laughter breaks out, bitter, relieved. You've survived, though the desert has erased the road. From here, navigation begins again. The guide studies the sun, squints at faint dune lines, sniffs the air for moisture. You marvel at the resilience. How people made maps not from ink, but from memory, instinct, and stubbornness. Hours later, as the caravan trudges across the remade landscape, you pass a dune that looks like a sleeping giant. Its curve is perfect, almost sculptural, as though an artist had carved it overnight. Someone jokes that it's the spirit of the storm, curled up after its tantrum. You laugh, but you can't shake the thought. The desert isn't empty. It's alive, not with trees or rivers or animals in abundance, but with forces vast, invisible, and unpredictable. Forces that humble every traveler. As the sun dips low, painting the horizon copper, you realize storms were both curse and gift. Yes, they destroyed paths, but they also cooled the land, shifted dunes to reveal hidden wells, even fertilized distant soils when dust drifted as far as Europe or the Amazon. What feels like disaster in the moment can be lifeblood for another land entirely. You drink sparingly that night, sand still crunching between your teeth. The desert may have tried to erase you, but you are still here, still moving, still stubbornly alive. The caravan moves on, slower now, as though every step carries the memory of storms past. You ride in silence, the desert wide and golden all around you. The guide raises his hand, pointing forward. In the distance, almost shimmering in the morning haze, are faint shapes on the horizon. At first, your weary eyes doubt them. Are they dunes? Rocks? Some cruel mirage again? But no. As the sun climbs, the shapes sharpen. Low mud walls, clustered palms, a scattering of tents and stone. An oasis town, civilization in the middle of nowhere. Mainstream fact. Towns like Timbuktu, Gao, and Wallata became vital waypoints on trans-Saharan routes. These weren't just watering holes. They grew into thriving centers of trade, scholarship, and culture. Merchants from North Africa met traders from West Africa, exchanging salt for gold, books for ivory, even gossip for fresh news of distant wars. Caravans might limp into town half-dead, but they would leave weeks later stronger, richer, and connected to a larger world. The caravan erupts in relief, smiles, laughter, even a few tears. You don't just see water, you smell it. Damp earth, green fronds, a sweetness on the air so unlike the metallic dryness of sand. The camels, usually stoic, raise their heads and quicken their pace as though they, too, can sense the reward. The first thing you do, drink. Cool water ladled from a clay jar, tasting of minerals and safety. It floods your mouth, overflows your throat, drips down your chin. You don't care. You drink like a child at a fountain. Around you, the caravan does the same, men, women, even animals collapsing in joy. Quirky tidbit. Travelers sometimes wrote that desert towns had such strong smells they could be detected from miles away. Dates fermenting, camel dung burning, sweat, and spices mingling in the still air. To outsiders, it was intoxicating. To locals, it was simply home. You chuckle as you realize. After weeks of camel breath and dust storms, you'd happily bathe in camel dung perfume if it meant you weren't choking on sand anymore. The town itself hums with energy. Markets buzz with voices Arabic, Berber, Songhai, Hausa, all overlapping like a chorus. You see salt slabs stacked like gold bars, and actual gold dust weighed on brass scales. Books bound in leather lie open on carpets, scholars gesturing with animated hands. Children dart between stalls, goats wander lazily, women in indigo robes carry baskets on their heads with effortless grace. Historians still argue whether Timbuktu's reputation as a mythical gold city was exaggerated by Europeans or whether it truly dazzled travelers as a beacon of wealth and learning. What's certain is that desert oases became bridges between worlds, connecting Mediterranean cities like Fez and Cairo to West African empires like Mali and Songhai. Without caravans, such towns would have remained isolated. With them, they became legends. You stroll deeper into the town, senses overwhelmed. Every stall offers temptation, sweet dates, spiced meat, fabrics dyed brilliant blues. Someone thrusts a handful of cola nuts into your palm, bitter, energizing, a desert traveler's version of coffee. You chew gag at first, then find yourself strangely alert. But it's not just trade goods. It's knowledge. You wander into a shaded courtyard where men sit cross-legged, copying manuscripts by hand. Astronomy, medicine, poetry, all written in looping calligraphy. You realize, these are the navigators of the mind. While guides chart stars and dunes, these scribes map ideas, keeping civilizations connected long after the caravan moves on. Night falls. The desert air cools, and the town glows with lanterns. Music drifts through the alleys. Rhythmic drums, plucked strings, soft voices singing of journeys, storms, and loves left behind. You sit cross-legged on a woven mat, eating flatbread dipped in honey, letting the sound lull you. For the first time in weeks, you don't think about thirst or direction or survival. You just exist. Yet even here, the desert whispers its reminder. This is only a pause. Tomorrow or the next day, the caravan will load again. The road to the north still stretches long. Salt must reach the Mediterranean. Gold must find its way back south. You realize the desert doesn't end. It only allows breaks. The guide leans close, his face lit by firelight. You walked the dunes, he says softly, so you belong to them now. Even here, in comfort, you'll hear them calling. You smile, unsure if it's a warning or a blessing. Maybe both. You sleep under a roof, grateful for walls, though the sound of wind outside reminds you of dunes shifting, storms prowling. But instead of dread, you feel a strange peace. You've crossed part of a vast, hostile world without stars to guide you. Only dust, instinct, and sheer persistence. And in the middle of that emptiness, you found people, trade, and resilience. The desert didn't defeat you. It reshaped you. And now, as the last embers of the caravan's fire fade into the hush of night, you let your mind drift. The storm's roar quiets, the dunes flatten into soft curves, and the relentless sun gentles into a warm afterglow. You imagine yourself reclining beneath palm fronds at the oasis, the cool water still fresh on your lips, the weight of travel finally lifted. Breathe deeply. The air here no longer carries dust. Instead, it feels heavy with calm, as though every grain of sand has settled into place just for you. The camels have folded themselves into the earth, their groans replaced by silence. The town behind you hums softly with music and laughter, but it's distant, like a memory half asleep. The desert, once harsh and endless, is now tender. Each dune becomes a pillow. Each star above, though you never truly needed them, glimmers like a lullaby. The caravan fades into a story, the hardships softened into whispers. What remains is the rhythm of your own breath, steady as the march of camels, gentle as the rustle of palms. You are safe. You are still. And the desert, with all its storms and trials, cradles you now in quiet. Let your thoughts slow, like sand slipping through an hourglass. Let your body sink into the stillness. Tomorrow's journeys can wait. Tonight, you rest in the timeless calm of the Sahara. Good night, traveler. Sleep well.